Welcome to Telerounds, a continuing education series brought to you by the National Center for Neurogenic Communication Disorders at the University of Arizona. The mission of the National Center is research, research training, information dissemination, and continuing education. The center is funded by the National Institute on Deafness and Other Communication Disorders. The title of today's nationally televised conference is Co-Constructing Meaning in Conversations with a Man with Severe Aphasia. Your host for today's program is Dr. Catherine Bayless, Assistant Director of the National Center for Neurogenic Communication Disorders and Professor of Speech and Hearing Sciences at the University of Arizona. Today's featured speaker is Dr. Charles Goodwin, Professor of Anthropology at the University of South Carolina. And now here is your host, Dr. Catherine Bayless.
Welcome to Telerounds. Today we will consider how communication can take place between a man with severe aphasia who is able to speak only 3 words and his family members. Before we introduce our featured speaker, I want to extend a special welcome to viewers at the following sites: First Care in Shreveport, Louisiana, the Speech Pathology Department at River Ridge in Kennebank, Maine, and Northeast Arkansas Rehabilitation in Jonesboro, Arkansas. Our featured speaker is Dr. Charles Goodwin, who is a linguistic anthropologist and expert at conversation analysis, and as such provides an important perspective on the conversational ability of individuals with aphasia. Dr. Goodwin has studied the interactions of a man with severe aphasia, and he's here to share his analyses with us. Welcome, Dr. Goodwin.
Thank you.
I know that the man whom you're going to talk about today is very special to you.
Yes, he's my father.
Can you tell us a little bit about his medical history?
Yes. My father was a successful lawyer. In 1980, he suffered a massive stroke that affected his left cerebral hemisphere. As a result of the stroke, he was left with paralysis of his right side and a severe aphasia. Initially, he was unable to produce any intelligible speech. He did receive speech therapy, and by the time of his discharge, he could produce 5 or 6 intelligible words. Within a short time of his return home, his speech stabilized at 3 words: yes, no, and and.
Dr. Goodwin, how did you come to do a formal study of your father's communication ability?
I communicated with him for many years, and it was apparent that despite his very limited vocabulary, he was a full-fledged person, someone I could really talk to about almost anything. Meanwhile, in my own research, I'd been making videotapes of people in natural settings, such as family dinners. I used the videotapes to show that sentences, utterances, and other linguistic structures weren't built by just one party, the speaker, but instead emerged through processes of interaction in which non-speaking parties, such as hearers, were very important co-participants in the collaborative process of building meaning. It became clear to me that I could use these same analytic techniques to make explicit how my father was able to say so much with so little vocabulary. So I began to tape daily life in our home. Rob's language poses particular difficulties for analysis. The lack of any syntax at all in his utterances makes it almost impossible to use traditional linguistic and psycholinguistic research to analyze his language. Nonetheless, as Audrey Hollins observed, people with severe aphasia are able to communicate far better than they can speak. I want to describe the life that emerged from my family from the playing out year after year of a communication system in which one party was able to produce only 3 words. The methods of a comparatively new field, conversation analysis, can shed considerable light on how Rob's able to use language to build relevant meaning by tying his limited talk to the more elaborate talk of those around him. Of all the words in a language, why would these 3 be especially useful to someone in Rob's position? Note that all 3 presuppose links to other talk and ties other units of talk, such as clauses, to each other. Yes and no are prototypical examples of answers used to build a response to something that someone else has said. As in this example, in which Rob uses yes to say that he does want toast, but that no, he doesn't want cheese. This vocabulary set presupposes that its user is embedded within a community of other speakers. This raises the possibility that despite the extraordinary sparseness of this system, its speaker might nonetheless be able to engage in complicated language games, to say a wide range of different things while performing diverse kinds of action by making use of resources provided by the speech of others. Let's look at a simple example of how Rob's talk is linked to the talk of others. Because of the deteriorating health of Rob's wife, the family's hired a nurse. Rob's lying in bed while the nurse is pulling a sock up over Rob's leg. As she moves to adjust the upper part of the sock, Rob says something and points toward the sock. The nurse looks to Rob and then back to the sock. In line 3, the nurse states a guess about what Rob might be trying to bring to her attention. Up more? This guess is delivered as a question, visible in part through its rising terminal pitch. The question builds a context that shapes the interpretation of whatever will be said in reply to it. By saying up more in line 3, the nurse creates a slot for Rob to either confirm or reject her proposed understanding of what he's trying to tell her. His yes achieves a relevant sense by occurring within an environment that has been constructed through the prior work of his interlocutor. Several features of the processes of inference and action occurring here require further comment. First, despite his inability to speak novel sentences, Rob's able to recognize and participate in the pragmatic organization of conversation, to produce a competent reply at precisely the place where such a reply is relevant. Second, the actions of his interlocutor here take a very special form, a guess about what he's trying to say. It's the immediate local activity that they're both engaged in together, that of putting on his sock, that enables her to figure out what he's trying to tell her almost immediately. The texture of intelligibility provided by a mutually recognized activity is central to the processes of inference and action through which Rob and his collaborators accomplish situated meaning. Indeed, in line 6, Rob ties his talk not to something the nurse has said, but to an action she's just performed in that activity. After the nurse pulls up his sock, he replies, yes. Adjacency pairs are used to build multi-party social action through talk. Paired actions produced by different speakers, such as question and answer or guess and reply, are among the most basic sequence types found in conversation. Much of Rob's interaction is accomplished through expansion of these basic sequences. We'll now look at a simple example. At the point where this exchange begins, the nurse is asking Rob what he wants for breakfast. She suggests an English muffin. English muffin? Yes. And what would you like on it? Jelly? No. Butter? Yes. Okay. The common way in which sequences are expanded to take into account the limitations of Rob's vocabulary is through the addition of alternative guesses as to what Rob might want or be trying to say, as when the nurse says butter. This expansion ends when Rob accepts a guess. Thus, in line 4, after asking Rob what he wants on his English muffin, the nurse proposes a first possibility, jelly. When Rob rejects this with a no, the nurse offers a second possibility, butter, in line 7. And when this is accepted by Rob at line 8, the search sequence reaches its conclusion. Now, crucially, Rob's yes and no as words are very different interactive objects, and they constitute very different kinds of events. Yes provides an exit from the guessing sequence, while no leads to the cycling of another round with a new guess. The present sequence, with a single additional guess, is an example of a simple, brief expansion. However, on many occasions, these expansions become quite protracted. A long and sometimes exhausting search is needed to uncover what Rob's trying to tell those around him. A number of phenomena implicated in the organization of sequences with Rob are visible here. First, unlike many problematic negotiations, it's assumed that there's a correct answer to the search and that one particular party, Rob, knows that answer and is entitled to tell others whether they're right or wrong. Second, as a consequence of this and the restrictions on what Rob's able to say, there's a strong division of labor. The activity generates a set of participants who perform different kinds of action. Rob accepts or rejects proposals about what he might be trying to say, while his interlocutors provide relevant guesses. Third, though Rob's the party who speaks the least, the organization of the activity locates him as the central focal participant. The sometimes frustrating and tedious work of everyone else is being done only in order to uncover what Rob's trying to say. Thus, though his wife participates in this sequence at line 6, it's at the service of helping someone understand what her husband wants, not to speak on her own behalf. Fourth, in order to formulate new guesses, Rob's interlocutors engage in systematic work by searching for alternatives within the same natural category set. For example, butter as an alternative to jelly within the set of foods that are spread on English muffins. English muffin? Yes. And what would you like on it? Jelly? No. Butter? Yes. Okay. Like the encompassing activity, the category set is used as a resource for building communication. However, those speaking with Rob sometimes apply the wrong category set to his talk. This poses serious problems of understanding and can lead to difficult sequences as Rob and his partners try to work out together what he wants to tell them. To explore such issues, we'll now look at how the fact that Rob wanted an English muffin was determined through a tortured walk through contested category systems.
You like toast?
Yes. No.
Cheese?
No.
Butter?
No. No.
Just jelly.
No.
Let me
English
show you.
muffin?
Yeah.
You want an English muffin?
Yes. Yes.
And
Just
what would you
one.
like on it? Jelly?
No.
Butter?
Butter?
Yeah.
Okay.
If we look just at Rob's talk, he appears to be a powerful but very limited actor, someone who responds almost like a binary robot as others frame choices for him. English muffin? Yes. And what would you like on it? Jelly? No. Butter? Yes. Okay. In practice, however, he's able to deploy a large repertoire of subtly differentiated actions, each precisely fitted to the environment within which it emerges. To demonstrate this, we'll now look in more detail at what happens here, focusing in particular on Rob's ability to produce many structurally different kinds of yeses and nos. Within this sequence, framing issues pose particular problems for the participants. As we learn at the end, Rob wants an English muffin. Knowing this, consider the problems posed for Rob in answering the nurse's query as to whether he'd like toast with a vocabulary restricted to yes and no. These words make everything a binary choice. However, in practice, a proposal, such as, would you like toast, might not be clearly wrong or exactly right, but instead almost right, in the ballpark, something that, while not entirely correct, should not be rejected, since its closeness to what's actually being sought by Rob provides a strong clue, a point of departure for further work. Well, Rob doesn't want toast. He wants one of its closest relatives, an English muffin. And indeed, this is something that's always served toasted. If Rob were to answer with an outright no, it's possible that his interlocutors would start to search for alternatives to toast and offer him other types of breakfast food. For example, a bowl of cereal or eggs. In brief, neither yes, I want toast, or no, I don't want any toast, are answers that will smoothly guide further talk toward queries about English muffins. Though Rob's vocabulary is very limited, he's able to visibly move the listener toward what he wants through tone of voice and body behavior. In reply to the nurse's query about toast, he uses the word yes, but ends it with falling rising intonation, indicated in the transcript by a comma. This contour frequently occurs after non-terminal items in a list, and it's one way of displaying that the larger unit in progress, the list itself, hasn't yet come to completion. We noted earlier that yes and no can function as different kinds of sequential objects, with yes accepting the guess and thus closing the search, while no rejects the guess and continues the search. Here, the speaker says the word yes, but uses intonation to display that the search should not yet be closed. He thus produces an object that might be heard as affirming the toast in some form is wanted, but signals his interlocutors to continue their guessing and probe further. Consistent with such a possibility is the way in which this yes is spoken, and how it contrasts markedly with how that word is said in lines 15 and 17. Here, where the search has successfully reached its conclusion, both yeses end with the prototypical intonation display of final completion, a falling terminal contour, indicated by the period in the transcript. Other features of Rob's intonation communicate mood. For example, the rise in pitch in the midst of the yes in line 15, marked with underlining, shows appreciation and enthusiasm.
Yeah.
You want an English muffin?
Yes. Yes.
The philosopher Wittgenstein argued that language deceives us by making phenomena appear identical to each other when in fact they're quite diverse. Though Rob's using what is semantically the same word, yes, through variation in the way that he speaks it, he's able to construct different meanings which project alternative possibilities for future action. To further explore the diverse entities that can be suggested in the same word, consider the yes in line 13. If the yes in line 13 is heard as an acceptance of the proposal in line 12, a signal that Rob wants an English muffin, then the sequence in lines 14 and 15, in which this very same request is made and affirmed, appears somewhat bizarre, a repetition of something that's already been done. However, through the way in which he speaks the yes in line 13 and his body movement, Rob frames the request as something different than outright acceptance. In the sequence, Rob's withdrawn his gaze and thus dismantled the state of heightened mutual orientation that had been sustained until this point. On hearing English muffin, he jerks his head back toward his wife and gazes intently at her with an expectant look. The yes itself is spoken in such a way as to simultaneously display heightened interest while soliciting further talk. Through the way in which he organizes his body and his talk, Rob shapes his yes here as both a request to hear again what his wife has just said and an expectant, though still tentative, I think you've got it. Such an object is quite different from the confirmatory, appreciative yes that follows a moment later.
Let me show you.
Yeah.
You want an English muffin?
Yes.
Some of the ways in which these differences in these two types of action are signaled are visible in their waveforms and pitch tracks. The two yeses differ from each other in pitch shape, pitch height, duration, and amplitude. Thus, the yes in line 15 begins with a strong rise in pitch that extends well above anything in the first yes. It's also louder and longer. The choices offered in lines 3, 5, and 9, cheese, butter, and jelly, are not alternatives to toast, but things that can be spread on members of the class that contains toast, English muffin, rolls, and bread. To get his English muffin, Rob's faced with the practical problem of producing a no that, instead of recycling more guesses, exits from the sequence. To investigate how this is done, it's necessary to look in detail at the no's that occur here. Immediately after saying yes to the query about toast in line 1, Rob adds a no, and immediately follows this with a gesture in which he holds his hand in the air while rotating it from side to side.
You like toast?
Yes. No.
With the benefit of hindsight, it's easy for an analyst to argue that by saying both yes and no, Rob might be trying to create an answer that could display that toast was almost, but not quite right, and that his gesture portrays the round shape of an English muffin, one of the most salient ways in which it contrasts with toast. However, interpreting both talk and gestures like this is a continuing, difficult task for those who live with Rob, one of the main contingencies they face. The gesture contributed to an embodied sequence which successfully signaled that the search for what Rob wanted was not yet resolved, despite the yes in line 2. The nurse treats the search as still open by quickly offering another guess about what he might be looking for, namely cheese. Rob's response is not a simple no, but no, no. This reduplicated no, no is frequently used to oppose a line of activity, to object to what someone's doing. However, although this may be what Rob's trying to do, the subtleness of the process is clearly demonstrated by the fact that the person he's talking to continues to search for alternative condiments. In line 8, Rob's able to demonstrate that he's opposing the sequence itself rather than the choices being offered within it in a much more clear and vivid fashion. What he does is say no before the nurse has even produced a next alternative. By speaking where he does, Rob uses the one appropriate word available to him to mark opposition to what the nurse is trying to do, the condiment sequence itself, rather than a particular choice emerging within it. In line 10, in response to his wife's "just jelly," Rob, who'd been gazing intently toward his wife as she spoke, produces a soft, short no, while moving his gaze beyond where they're standing. As he does this, his face, gesture, and body vividly show frustration. He thus displays to his co-participants frustrated disengagement from the process they've been pursuing together.
Butter?
No. No.
Just jelly.
This frustrated withdrawal from the sequence at last gets Rob's interlocutors to abandon the condiment sequence. In different ways, each moves to a different activity. The nurse, who'd been standing in one place throughout the sequence, starts walking to the refrigerator to attempt a different way of finding out what he wants, showing him what's in the refrigerator. Simultaneously, his wife shifts category classes, exiting from the condiment sequence to ask if he wants an English muffin.
Yes. Yes.
And what would you like?
Throughout each day of their lives, members of this family face the problem of how to understand Rob so that they can accomplish together the events that make up their lives. This process, which mobilizes both language and social organization to convey meaning, sits at the very center of what it means to be human. the task of building meaning together is inaccessible to analysis if research focuses exclusively on processes hidden in the brain of a single individual. Linguists have framed the study of language in such a way that the messy details of talk and interaction are outside the scope of linguistics proper. However, the data examined here demonstrate the central importance of sequential organization and the actions, words, intonation, and visible behavior of all participants in a communicative interchange. The events investigated in here call into question traditional assessments of competence based purely on the ability to produce language. When Rob was in the hospital, his doctors, focused entirely on the trauma within his brain, said that any therapy would be merely cosmetic and a waste of time, since the underlying brain injury couldn't be remedied. Nothing could have been farther from the truth, and medical advice based on such a view of the problem can cause irreparable harm to patients such as Rob and their families. In this system, Rob's wife has become the spokesperson. This is impossible in large part because of their shared history. She has intimate knowledge of the events of his life and their life together. He can cue her to share information that no other person knows. In fact, Rob's able to tell a story about events that happened 50 years ago by using gesture to get his wife to recall the relevant incident. As she talks, he acts as co-teller by using gesture and intonation to comment on her talk. Though Rob's abilities as an individual declined catastrophically, the social system within which he's embedded adapts to this crisis and evolves by creatively reshaping frameworks for the organization of interaction so that he's able to continue to function as a viable, indeed central actor in the courses of collaborative action that make up their lives. If Rob were isolated from his family, for example, if he were to be put in a nursing home, he would have much poorer communication potential. He would lose the resources of relevant others who have a rich history with him. The relevant unit for the analysis of Rob's condition is not him as an individual, but rather the frameworks for the production of meaning and action within human interaction that link him to family members who share and have shared his life with him. The story of Rob's recovery is an incredible example of the importance of the family in the ability of an individual to communicate, have a sense of identity, and a high quality of life.
Thank you, Dr. Goodwin. Before beginning our discussion, I'd like to introduce and welcome Pat Reitzman to our program. Pat is Rob's daughter and Dr. Goodwin's sister. I might also mention that she is a nurse talking to us from Massachusetts. Welcome, Pat.
Hello there. Thank you.
I'm glad you could join us. And I'd like to give you the first question. Can you describe what it was like for you to communicate with your father after his stroke?
Initially, when he first had his stroke?
That's right, in the first period.
Right. I guess my nursing came into play because I was aware of the fact that the aphasia could be in different stages, and I was very concerned initially with how much language he had lost and whether it would be coming back. And I think initially our communication really involved asking him to speak more and say more than in fact he could do. I think I was at that time wanting more words from him and frequently asking questions or engaging in conversation that would draw more words.
Well, we can see that you and your whole family become very skilled in helping him communicate. And we have a segment of tape, I think you're familiar with it, of you communicating with your father. And I'd like to play that for our viewers and then maybe have you respond to it and maybe also you, Chuck.
Yes.
Yeah.
Did,
When we went with Mac and June, we sat at a table just as we came in the front door. We sat with them there, and then so 5 of us can fit there. 6 o'clock. 5 people. It's 7 o'clock?
No.
6 o'clock. 7,
people.
5,
7 people. Who
is
are
that
they?
6?
2?
7?
Yes.
Invite somebody?
Yes.
Mac and June?
Yes.
Oh. Oh.
Pat, you were very patient and definitely communicated respect for what your father was trying to express. Have you any comments about that sequence?
Yes, that's a very good example of how we do engage in our day-to-day life. I have great respect for the fact that he always knows what he wants to communicate. So we're never doing this for no good purpose. He is always has a clear idea, and at this point he usually knows that he can communicate it if we go down the right path. So it is easy to have patience with him, knowing from a lot of success that if we can come at it in the right category, as my brother said, then we can find the answer.
Have you comments about that sequence?
Yes, I find it an extremely interesting sequence. Again, because of my interest in language as a social phenomenon, I'm very interested in how meaning is built socially. And here we have what appears to be a very simple gesture for, say, the word 5. But we find that you can't understand the meaning of 5 just by getting its lexical meaning. Instead, it has to be embedded in a relevant activity frame. And what's really interesting about this sequence is that, in fact, there's 2 relevant frames: the time you're going to dinner and the number of people who go. And the only way that they manage to figure out whether it's going to be 5 o'clock or 7 people is through sequential organization, that Rob produces a gesture and then Pat displays talk showing her understanding of the gesture. And since she's doing that right next to the gesture, he can see that she's wrong, and then use not just his hand, but his whole body in the way he lowers his hand and raises it to get her to try another guess and to keep trying another guess until she finally gets what he's trying to say.
Having heard your comments, it might be interesting to just take another look at that sequence, and I think that we can. Let's look at it again and watch for the things you pointed out.
When we went with Mac and June, we sat at a table just as we came in the front door. We sat with them there, and then so 5 of us can fit there. 6 o'clock, 5 people. It's 7 o'clock?
No.
6 o'clock. 7
people.
5.
7 people. Who
Is
are
that 6?
they?
2. 7.
Yes.
Invite somebody.
Yes.
Mac and June.
Yes.
Oh. Oh.
Do you find that your father gets frustrated?
Yes. And it's extremely interesting, and it's certainly very much a real individual emotion. One of the things that interests me in looking at these tapes is that the frustration itself becomes a communicative event. So if we look at both the English muffin and the 7 people sequence, we see that when he turns away in frustration, in both cases, that's precisely the point when my mother suddenly shifts categories and manages to figure out what he's saying. So the frustration is incredibly real and powerful, but itself has become mobilized within the interaction in our family.
Pat, and for you also, Chuck, do you find that you get frustrated? It seems to me that it takes quite a bit of patience and it's fairly labor-intensive for you to help him communicate.
I do think frustration is probably the biggest barrier you need to go past, and there are times when it is extremely frustrating because you do not successfully find the answer or are able to determine what he wants to communicate, and then it is very frustrating because there's an awareness that there's something important to him and you can't get it.
Your mother, I think, as you've well pointed out, has had a very special role in this, and because she has the shared history with him, is very important to his being able to communicate what he wants. Has this been quite difficult for her?
Oh yes, it certainly has. My father was about 65 when he had the stroke, and I'm sure as therapists you're all aware of not only the problems with speech, but the general physical problems. She had to get him up every morning, give him an incredibly series of difficult exercises, put a brace on his leg, get him dressed. He was paralyzed on one side, and help him through, in many cases, throughout the day. Now, that was okay when she was in her early 20s and she had me as a baby, but facing these same kinds of tasks at age 65 was extraordinary. It took an extraordinary amount of work, and it was kind of incredible. And I guess it's part of why, from my own perspective, not only as a conversation analyst, but as a family member, I really see aphasia as a social problem. It didn't just affect my father. It affected the whole family, and more than anybody, my mother. And I'm not an expert in healthcare, but it seems that our healthcare system focuses only on the patient and only at the time of trauma. And it's really even many years after the trauma that my mother could still require extensive help. And more recently, she's gotten Parkinson's, so that the situation is even far more difficult at this point.
Pat, would you agree that it would have been beneficial if your mother could have had some therapy or counseling or support group work through this period since your father's stroke?
Yes, I think the point that Chuck just made is that there is a lot of help available initially, and that was wonderful. The rehab center especially was where we got a lot of help. But then it ends, and then you're on your own, and we're now 16 years later, and those support networks are not in place past the initial time. I think it would have been tremendously helpful as we were moving through.
You have both definitely raised our consciousness about the types of strategies that family members can use to help an affected individual communicate. Now, I suspect that some people would just develop these through trial and error, but it seems to me it would also be beneficial if clinicians were to actually discuss these with family members. I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
It would be very, very beneficial. It would help a lot. I would also think, and this is more difficult, but to make some of this knowledge available to the larger community. What I remember in particular was that immediately after my father's stroke, the doctors inserted a catheter in his penis. And as they were doing this, he was pointing and gesturing and going, no, no, and things, or I don't know what words he had. But the doctors just ignored this. In fact, I think they said, well, he's brain damaged. We don't know what's going on with him. Then 3 days later, they found out that they'd inserted the catheter wrong, and he'd been in pain the entire time. Now, even though they were the experts on his medical condition, he was a valid co-participant in that process, someone who had a unique perspective. And I think it's important to recognize that despite the lack of speech, the person is a full-fledged human being who has something to say. And that seems to be the core of what the other things are built on.
That's a very dramatic example. Pat, what's your experience in observing how other people communicate with your father? Can you see that they would benefit from having some tutoring about how to read body language and gestures and intonation?
Yes, definitely. What I see most often is that people do take their cue from the family, from my mother, and from all of us in terms of how to interact with my father in this case. So they watch to see what we do and then sort of mimic pattern from that. So it was really important and significant that my mother from day one always treated my father with great respect and that he was the one who would make decisions for himself. I think what would have helped me more than anything, speech therapists were wonderful in terms of support and information, but I wish I had talked to other family members, other people who were going through it or who were further down the road, who had had a year or two in, so that they could have passed on what they learned by experience.
Yes, well, I think all of our viewers would agree with you that we all hate to see resources shrink and less money is available, because we recognize that it is an evolving problem. And it is my understanding that, you say it's been 16 years, now it's quite a different reality for your mother today, as I understand.
Yes.
Right.
As she's herself has a chronic illness.
Right.
And could benefit from the help. We've had a couple of questions come in. Let me pose them to you. From Sheila Stewart at New Mexico State University comes the question, is there a way to represent topics to your father in a low-text style, for example, through pictures, and do you feel this would help?
I certainly have long thought that it would help. However, he has, in one sense, been reluctant at using certain aids like a picture board, and I don't know why. I've long thought that would be great. But he kind of makes use of this. He will frequently try to use whatever resources are available in the environment to try to get us to understand what he's saying. One example I remember is that I took him out and we were having the car serviced, and he tried to tell me something and he couldn't get it. So as soon as the car was serviced, he had me drive over to a shopping mall. We got his electric scooter, which I'll point out is very important for him because it gives him a whole world outside. He got the electric scooter, and we went to about 6 different stores before we found an object that would allow him to tell me what he wanted to say. So he's very resourceful in trying to pull in features from the environment to make himself understood.
Have you comments on that, Pat?
I think that's a wonderful example of he will go to great lengths to communicate. I am interested, I don't know much now about what the computer technology is that's available also, wondering if that might be something that would give somebody a broader resource for searching out information.
Well, indeed, there are some wonderful options that are out there now, and probably you can, by contacting professionals in your area, get some counseling about them. We also have a question that's come to us from Carl Ludy at the VA in Martinez, California, and he says, I would like to ask Professor Goodwin if he has any general comments or observation about speech therapists' involvement with discourse-level linguistics and pragmatics.
First, my real field is conversation analysis, so I haven't had as much experience in speech therapy per se. But there's a really excellent new book that I recall that Lisa Menn recommended in her last telerounds by Lesser and Milroy, I believe, and I think it's called Aphasia and Linguistics. But one of the things that the book does, it compares many different kinds of therapy, including 2 different kinds of therapy on the discourse, or not so much therapy, excuse me. It contrasts different theoretical and practical frameworks for the analysis of discourse, including both speech act theory of the type done by Grice and Searle and conversation analysis. And it really has an excellent introduction to conversation analysis and how that might be relevant for the analysis of therapy. So I'd strongly recommend the book to someone who'd like to find out more about this, as well as course of the books that are on that I put on the reading list of the handout. And I'll mention in particular the work of Harvey Sachs and his lectures, which are really quite extraordinary.
Pat and Chuck, do you feel like you improved in your ability to communicate with your father over time?
I certainly do.
Enormously. It's a learning process. We learn much of it from him.
Well, that certainly suggests that it would be beneficial for clinicians to use this and use the information that you've given in the first part of the program to begin to share that with people who are maybe not as sophisticated about language and conversation as the members of your family are through your interests, and begin to make other folks aware of these things. It strikes me, though, that an important asset that your father has is your belief, both of you and your whole family, in his competence and also respect for his desire to communicate something. I think sometimes people are ignored.
Yes, I know.
Mm-hmm. And just left, right. and people aren't so active in terms of trying to help them communicate. What are the critical factors, maybe related to your father, that make him a successful communicator?
I think the most important thing is that he's a very outgoing person. On the one hand, I think he's very realistic. He accepted, at least as I recall, fairly early on what his state, the condition he was left in with the stroke. And in this, perhaps, he contrasted with my mother, who also accepted that and was very strong. But I know that she told me that she dreamed for years that he'd be speaking to her again. And there was always this hope. I mean, it's a tremendous thing. But Dad accepted this, and what he's done is he's really then tried to live his life to the fullest. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that's been really important to him is this little scooter. So he's always going. He's going to movies by himself. He goes miles. I'm impressed. He's known all over town. He goes and buys bagels in the morning. And so he tries to maintain as full and rich a life as he can. He's wonderful with his grandchildren. He has incredible emotion, loves to talk and be with them. And I think that it's that attitude more than anything else, well, I'll say more than the only other thing I think that's important is his condition. And I think that, at least to me, what seems crucial is that he has so much intact comprehension, and that he can still, despite his vocabulary, he can still really understand what's happening. But that, combined with its outgoingness, has meant that despite this incredible poverty of language, he's lived a very full, rich life for these past 15 years.
Pat, what are your thoughts on that? Do you have anything you might like to add?
Yeah, I agree with everything Chuck has said. It is his zest for life and his vibrance that really catches you. I've also noticed that he's developed certain talents, such as his memory is incredible now. I think of necessity, he must hold in his memory anything that he wants to pass on, because he can't write it down, or he can't tell you when he's thinking of it. He has to wait for an opportunity. And in our family, it's now known that if you really need something to be remembered, my father is the one to do it. He will not forget anything that needs to be remembered. And since we know he's developed that, I think, in compensation, and since we know he has that ability, whenever he is presenting something, everyone respects it because he's so sharp in that way.
Well, that's a very important point, I think, and it has clinical implications, certainly suggesting that the doctor who originally examined him and clinicians should be knowledgeable about the memory capacity. And it's also heartening to learn that his memory appeared to improve with these new demands. It sounds like that your father's basic premorbid personality traits also help make him successful. I'm assuming he was outgoing and
Yes.
before he had his stroke. Dr. Goodwin, how did you come to do this kind of in-depth analysis of your father's abilities?
Well, first by living it, but then my research had always been focused on the details of human interaction. And in particular, I really think the place is to go where people are actually living their lives. So I'd always be innovative in trying to get video camera into work sites or family dinners or wherever things were happening. And I lived this, and the more I looked at it, the more I realized how extraordinary it was. And then I thought, it's like you can't always choose what you want to do. You play the hand that you're dealt. And I was in this horrible situation, but I had these particular skills. So it seemed to me that maybe I could use these skills to make other people more aware of, first, the competence of somebody in this situation, and second, hopefully to shed some light on how he is such a useful communicator. So it was that sense of seeing this as a tragic but wonderful opportunity to turn the analytic skills I developed into something that might have meaningful results for people in this situation.
Well, I think it's very helpful to us. You're using your professional skills to formalize some of this interaction and really calling our attention to how many different parameters we really can control. How do strangers do in communicating with your father? Maybe Pat.
It's variable, and I'm fascinated by people and how they do respond. Some people are totally at ease and jump right in and start playing the guessing game from the get-go. As a short story, I happened to be with him in a store once and realized that he had gone there looking for a blowtorch, which is a long story, and that the salesperson had figured out what he wanted. And I was finding myself wondering how on earth he communicated it, and imagining this total stranger spending the time to play the game to figure out what it was. So people vary in terms of their degree of comfort, but if you demonstrate it how to communicate, they usually learn very quickly and get right in with you.
Has your father learned strategies for putting people at ease?
Yes, his humor. No matter what is happening, even if it's incredibly embarrassing, he will laugh, and you'll laugh with him. And we have lots of family stories about who's been in the most embarrassing situations. I think with humor, even when someone's trying to guess and can't figure it out, when he starts laughing, it relaxes the situation, and then people are more at ease to keep trying.
I'd also
Yes.
simply only other want to add to that he's not in any way ashamed of his condition. He's a very outgoing, positive person, and so presents himself to other people in that way as well. And I think that's also quite important about it.
Well, one of my questions that had come to mind was, how does your father express humor? So primarily through laughing or...
Oh, he does incredible kinds of jokes. Like, as I'm sure you all know, he has had, because of the paralysis, for example, some deafness. So I actually was looking at a sequence on tape recently where my mother was saying, well, gee, sometimes Dad doesn't hear me. And she was talking to my wife, and Dad just goes like, huh? Or something,
Yeah.
and made a whole joke of the thing. And then he has, I think, an extraordinarily rich emotional life, not only humor, but also, for example, appreciation and and evaluation of positive things. One of my favorite sequences of tape is where he's ordered some grapefruit from Florida, and he's showing how good the grapefruit is to Pat's daughter, to his granddaughter. And he's getting her to really appreciate, and he's doing all sorts of elaborate gestures to show how wonderful, and just to lead her step by step into the experience of having this wonderful thing together.
Well, another question that I had, in the tape sequence, you talked about him using gestures perhaps to
Right.
try and suggest the roundness of the
Right.
English muffin. Does he use his hands to draw while he's trying to communicate, to give you a cue?
No, I don't think he draws, but he uses very complicated gestures. For example, and we're actually beginning to look at this, but to indicate a lot of things, he might have his hand and break it up. He'll also use pointing gestures that are very, very complicated and require a lot of work to figure out. And once again, as I emphasized in the talk, frequently these pointing gestures depend upon knowing the activity in progress. So one time he pointed out the window. Now that could have been pointing over toward New York City, which was in that direction. I finally figured he was pointing toward the garage. Then I realized that my mother and my wife were out shopping, and I said, oh, it's about them, and I still tried to figure. And finally he was telling me that he wanted me to help them carry the bags in when they came in. But he uses the gesture then to really do quite complicated things.
That anecdote certainly suggests how important it is that you know your father.
Yes.
And you can intuit what he's likely to
Right.
be saying. And this shared history, I was really struck by how beneficial it is that he has your mother to help him, who shares the same life history with
Right.
him and many memories.
Right.
Would you think it would be a good idea for clinicians in dealing with people who are maybe in nursing homes who don't have a family member there with that shared history to actually obtain information about the person more in depth than we would routinely do to give that history?
Yes, I really do. I remember Audrey Holland telling me that one of the things that she did at a nursing home was that she had pictures from people when they were much younger. And one of her, the clients she was visiting, the patients, was this little old woman who was going around whizzing. But her picture on the door showed her to have been a wing walker back in the 30s. And you get this whole other perspective on somebody when you see who they really were before they got into their current condition. Yeah.
Have you any comments to make on that, Pat?
It's a wonderful story. Yes, I love that. You're really speaking to people in institutions, and bringing in personal pictures and personal stories helps all caretakers involved to know who the person is. It's hard to see that with someone who's very ill sometimes.
You talk about him having a lot of interchange with his grandchildren. How do your children do in communicating with your father?
The children, the younger they were, the more totally at ease they were with aphasia. Young children take it totally in their stride and begin to communicate. They learn quickly how you do communicate. And so my daughters were fairly young, and this is their so second nature to them. They're totally at ease with all communication with him.
I remember just one of Pat's daughters suggesting that in addition to no and yes, he should have learned the word awesome. She's a young kid.
Well, that's a good point to end this on. Unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our time. And I want to thank you, Dr. Goodwin, and I want to thank you, Pat, for sharing your insights with us. And please also thank your father for us. Now, some information on our next program. Do you feel the information age is passing you by? Do you use your computer for word processing and nothing else? Do you think 7-year-olds might know more about online systems than you do? While we have toiled to understand disease processes and adapt to new systems for healthcare delivery, the world has gone online, and a whole new method of accessing a wealth of data is at our fingertips. But not everyone knows how to get on the information superhighway. How would you respond to these questions?
What is the internet? I don't know, something on the computer where you can, I don't know. I have no idea. I'm not into computers.
Okay.
What is the internet?
Internet? I don't know. Computer.
What is the internet?
What is the internet? Isn't that the online through the computers within the internet? It's a computer system, right? Where you can get online and talk.
What's the World Wide Web?
The World Wide Web, that is the dictionary, the library. It's on computer as well. Put in your word you're looking for.
What kinds of things can you do once you access the internet? Do you know?
Once you access the internet, I'm not sure. I don't know about that.
First question is, what is the internet?
I'm not sure what the internet is.
I have the slightest idea.
What's the World Wide Web?
I don't know what that is neither. I told you, I don't know that fucking computer.
We don't know. I don't know either.
Okay, do you know what some of the things you can do once you have access to the internet or a computer?
Is the internet like somewhere you can find like different things about different topics, something like that? Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm not. I'm not quite sure. I'm kind of heard a little bit about it. Different. Okay.
Can you talk to other people's computers through the internet?
Yes, in a manner of speaking, you can talk to other people's computers on the internet. Our next program is designed to answer some of these questions, as well as give you specific advice about how to get online and how to access the internet and how it can help you professionally. Please join us for our next program on Wednesday, April 17th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, when our Center Net Managers, Dr. Nancy Helmestebrooks and Ralph Nye, will present Getting on the Information Superhighway, Accelerating Your Professional Potential. Please note the new date for this program. A revised announcement will be sent to you in a few weeks. Now, on behalf of the National Center for Neurogenic Communication Disorders at the University of Arizona, thank you for tuning in to Telerounds.
To order VHS taped copies of this program or to inquire about future Telerounds programs, contact us at area code 520-621-1819. Thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Harrison.